Good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 29th of April 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Thank you very much for coming on and spending some time with us this evening. I hope you're all well. And we're going to have an interesting discussion tonight with Chris Bates about property and related issues. So much to talk about, always plenty to talk about with regard to property. Just before I bring him in, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific property or financial or legal advice as a general conversation. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, and suggestions in. I won't necessarily follow all of the threads, but if you want to ask a question specifically to Chris or myself, use that Walk the World. That'll get into my queue and therefore get into my attention. I've enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get your question to the top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who do help us. It's quite expensive just to run all these things, so it really helps. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really important conversation to be had, especially now. Chris, let me bring you straight in. Welcome. How are you?
Doing well, Martin. I'm actually on time this time. You made a bit of a joke about it before. Last time we chatted a few months ago, we've been doing these for 5 or 6 years, I think. I've never been late, but I was actually in bed, ready to switch off. The last thing that went through my brain was, God, I've got to be on Martin's show. And I quickly ran out of bed with no shirt on, to be honest. I've got a shirt on as well tonight, so it's a double win.
No, excellent. And I must tell you, Chris, that of all the guests that I've had on, I've had quite a few guests on over the years. I've had to make more lower thirds for you than anybody else, because almost every time you come on, you seem to have a different title or a different firm under which you're working. So just give us an update on Alcove and your role as CEO.
Look, never hold on to anything too tightly, Martin. That's probably my philosophy. The business has been going for 11 years and we have had a few rebrands. Fortunately, we have changed the colour on the tin and the name, but many different reasons. A failed business merger, a rebranding to get out of the financial advice world, which we sold our business in, and then another refresh after a rebrand and a failed business merger. But the team behind the business has really stayed the same through that journey. And we're called Alcove now. We're about a team about 30 plus, split into different divisions. I sort of help a lot of clients like a mortgage broker would, guide them through the process. We do a lot in the more affluent parts of our capital cities, more the double income, higher income families is sort of our sweet spot. We've got a team that works with a lot of financial advisors. We come from a financial advice background. We've got a private banking division, which a guy who worked at CBA Private for a long time. We've got some guys who focus on people in the tech industry and real estate partners, etc. So it's sort of expanded. When we chatted, Martin, back in 2018, 2017, I was very early days in the business, and so it's changed a lot over the years, and it's a much, much bigger team now, which allows me to sort of understand the market in many different ways. We've got a much better understanding of the commercial market now, and just what all our different brokers. We lodge a lot more loans than we ever have, so more than we ever have. So, it's good to sort of be exposed to different parts.
And does scale help when it comes to negotiating with the banks, for example?
It's probably a bit of a myth. Some brokers will say, we write a lot more loans, we'll get better deals at the banks. It's not really true. You can get better service. That's absolutely possible. Banks will give preferential treatment to brokers who lodge more loans with them. But it's usually maybe just faster servicing time and maybe more reliable credit assessors. And they basically team you up with sort of, your own credit assessor in the bank, which allows you to get much more predictable outcomes when you're lodging loans, because you can sense check that with your credit assessor and, you can streamline your business a bit better. But whether you get better deals or not, I think that's a bit of a furphy.
Yeah, I always had that feeling, but it's something that I hear quite often from some of the big players that, volume matters, but I'm not sure that's not the total thing. What we might do later on is just come back in a bit more detail and talk a little bit about the different styles of broking that are out there. And, not all brokers are the same. And I think that's worth setting in context of a broader conversation I want to move to, which is the property market. And I want to start by just bringing a couple of points. This is from the Q&A last night, and there was quite a good question. Housing has become a rigged game. Investors win, renters lose, and politicians pretend they're fixing it. When will any of you, addressing the panel, admit the system's broken because you benefited from keeping it the way it is? And then this one, which I thought was also quite interesting, cotality, that's the new name of CoreLogic. I don't know where they came up with cotality from, goodness me. But anyway, Eliza Owen, the head of research, actually did an interesting article and basically posed the question, should home values come down? Because, she says values don't need to continually rise to deliver strong capital gains. Well, maybe. One of the greatest financial risks, falling home values. So there's an interesting question, and I guess it's two things. Is the property market behaving the way that you would expect it to behave, or is it that we should actually expect property values to come down, or will they go on going up forever? What do you think?
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that it is a bit of a Ponzi scheme, right? That obviously the system is rigged, and you can see that our wealth is heavily weighted to housing and the wealth effect. I don't see that system ever changing, to be honest. You just got to look at this current election, and what are they doing? They're just doing policies that are absolutely going to stimulate a huge amount of demand for first home buyers with really just a restricted supply entering the market. And that's got a lot harder in the last few years with obviously the challenges in the development market, the unpredictable sort of prices around materials, issues getting supply, competition with government resources to build, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think you're stimulating demand, and you're just creating and just kicking the can down the road every single year. I don't think any government's brave enough, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist also to figure out why. You can see where the voting public is usually homeowners, right? And so, or people who are aspiring to enter the market, or they've just recently entered and they don't really want house prices to go down. So, to expect that prices are going to go down is probably wishful thinking, and when the system is built this way.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm afraid that's my conclusion pretty much. I made a show the other day called Forget Affordable Housing for Generations, because there was quite an interesting article from Saul Estlake. You probably saw it when he was discussing the issues relating to the election. And he was saying that you've got to remember, there are 100,000 or so first-time buyers coming into the market each year, maybe another 600,000 aspiring to get in. But you've got a larger number of people who are in the property market, either with a mortgage or owning outright. And the last thing they want to do is to see property prices fall. So politicians, of course, play to the numbers, and therefore play to the larger proportion of people, firstly. And he also said, if you actually run a strategy that says what I want to do is to keep property prices maybe going slightly higher, but allow wages growth to try and grow even faster, it's going to be 60 or 70 years before affordability begins to actually come back to perhaps where it was. So, like it or not, we're in an unaffordable situation. And just the pure numbers means it's not going to get fixed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the desire to just keep the system going makes a lot of sense. The government makes so much money through new property, right? Think about all the taxes they make along the way. I think Labor have got, if let's say they win the election, right, that 5% deposit scheme is a huge bringing forward of future demand to where they have no income caps and increasing the city limits on different states around the country. There's really no excuse, particularly for first-home buyers, if they can't put together, say, a 5% deposit and then say 5% for stamp duty. Really, they can't say there's not enough properties. The properties they want to buy are above a cap. You can get a great property in Sydney under 1.5, for example. And I think a lot of first-home buyers will want to enter the market. And so you can see, you go to the Liberal Party, right, doing tax-deductible mortgages on new property. You've also got accessing super. You'll see Bank Innovation come out with 35, 40-year home loans. You've got some home equity schemes coming out from the government. So there's always new things that surprise us. The tax deductibility on home loans was a bit of a shock. And whether it happens this election or happens in the next election, you could see that easily happening. And access to super, well, might not happen this election, but who's to say it won't happen in a couple down the line? Like you, Martin, I was surprised all the way back through to COVID when the banks were allowed to do payment holidays for 6 months, right? So even when you think that the game's up, it doesn't mean that some innovation's going to come in and keep the party going, I guess. And I think that's what we've kind of been proven time and time again.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's right. And there's sort of pure modelling and pure economic sense, and then there's political overlay, and the political overlay is huge. And it's interesting, of course, the Productivity Commission quite recently published a report saying that all these home improvement and support schemes were actually not necessarily making homes more affordable for those who really needed them. People who would have bought them anyway are just getting them slightly earlier. So in a way, a lot of the schemes don't solve the fundamental problem. It's interesting that Labour's just announced another $2 billion offer to boost housing. They're going to offer money. It's going to be concessional money to state governments to boost housing supply. That's a sort of another attempt to try and get this 1.2 million up on the up the ramp there. And interestingly, the article suggests that this was from David Crowe, suggesting that this was in response to the other side of politics who was pushing a more explicit growth number in terms of builds. The coalition talking about 500,000 homes. So that's an interesting little twinkle towards the end of the campaign. I wonder how many people have actually got so confused now with all of these things that have been thrown out at various points by various sides, various parties, because each of the parties have been talking about home ownership to various extents. But I have to say that I don't think it's been a particularly coherent or logical set of discussions. And I'm not sure that really it's going to move the dial that much at the end of the day. More significantly, I think, is the bank's willingness to lend more, the banks pushing very much to reduce the buffers, and frankly, to just borrow for longer. More debt means people can borrow more.
Well, absolutely, Martin. If you go back to when I started in broking, 2013, 14, I've been a financial advisor for a while, and I started playing around with bank calculators, and I was like, surely not. You can't borrow 10 times income. Oh, wait, you can. If you do it like this, you can borrow 11 and a half times, 12 times. Back in 2013, 14, I was blown away. And if you use this calculator versus this bank, there were so many flaws in the calculators and not cross-referencing different applications, etc. APRA was, became aware of this in that 2014, 15 boom. They sort of came in and tightened up a lot of the way that banks did assessments, and they brought them much more in line, and they found little holes in the each bank's calculators, and they kind of went through them one by one. And then they put caps on interest-only loans and investment lending, etc. So lending has come right down. Back then it was absolutely, and it really encouraged, a lot of investment, right? And you could see that was an investment-driven boom back then. It made a lot more sense to be what you call a rent investor back then. Rates were reasonably high, and you could leverage much further into investment properties. But, the multiple times incomes come right back, and it's really sort of circa around maybe 5 times income. And in the 2021, 2022 boom, it was maybe about 7 times income. And so every borrower right now, their borrowing capacities dropped dramatically. And you can see this with all lending stats around, higher LVR loans and multiple incomes loans. They've gone way down from what they were, say, 2 or 3 years ago in terms of the percentages. So pretty much every borrower right now is borrowing every single dollar they can. And if they could borrow an extra 20, 30 grand somewhere else, they probably will, because they need it when they're out there in the marketplace. And they're rattling the tin, and they're getting more money than they ever have from parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles. And the intergenerational wealth transfer that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, I think, the giving while living versus is sort of, I guess, what the next generation are believing, right? Rather than giving it all away on death, they're giving it down earlier, and they know they have to, because the kids having problems renting. I mean, the rental crisis that we've seen over the last few years was kind of the veil. It was a slow moving problem that really got sort of highlighted when all the investors bailed over the last couple of years, because they couldn't really afford to maintain mortgages on high interest rates. And all the new investors really bought into regional hotspots and weren't replacing where the other investors were buying, together with, obviously immigration, et cetera. It's create a real issue with renting. And so the ability just to rent, particularly when you get to the housing, the family formation time of your life, and you're going from a couple and you're thinking about having your first baby, that's often when the light switch goes off for a lot of people, and they go, oh, I thought I could just rent forever. Maybe that's not a good idea if I have a kid. I want security. I want stability. I want to know about the school zones. I need to be able to get them into kindy. I want to be around my family for support, and it goes from, I can rent, to I really want to own. And even renting is really stressful. They don't want to enter the rental market because they're really worried they're going to get kicked out in school zones, etc. So that's the sort of the issue that's created. But if you do give borrowing capacity, anyone more borrowing capacity right now, they're going to spend it. And so every time there's a rate decrease, let's say a 0.25, that increases borrowing capacity about 2.5%. If we go by the market, I mean, they're saying sort of rates could be around sort of 3%, maybe a little bit under that by the end of the year. We're at 4.1 now. So let's say there's another 1% of cuts. Maybe there's a bit more. So there's 10% of borrowing capacity there. But as rate cuts happen, absolutely, you can already see a lot of the bank CEOs, and to be honest, it even goes much further than that, are putting a lot of pressure on, creating noise to say 3% buffer doesn't make sense in strong rate cutting environments. And it's really creating a haves and have-nots and making inequality worse, which is true because, the people who have got access to money are able to enter the market because they can get money from family, and the people who aren't having to, spend less. But if you give everyone more money, everyone's going to spend more money. And so if you increase borrowing capacity, 20%, because a 1% cut to the assessment rate would do that, let alone we see innovation around, not including HEX, 35, 40-year loans, 100% of bonus income. There's all these sort of changes that the banks are fiddling with. All that will go straight into prices pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the way I see it too. It's interesting that Westpac's talking about a 25 basis point reduction in May. People were talking more later, but the markets are definitely now talking multiple rate cuts through the year, and that's going to translate into higher borrowing capacity, especially for those, of course, with multiple jobs. And, it's interesting if you look at the latest analysis there, more people need 2 jobs just to live. The number of Australians with multiple jobs, according to this one, is going through the roof because more people need to actually work multiple jobs to be able to get the income to be able to pay for somewhere to live. So it's creating a series of cascading pressures on people. And I guess that takes me to the sort of the first question that I've got. This is from a viewer, Valerie, who sent me this message the other day, basically saying, I'm a first-time buyer. I've got a deposit, not a huge one, but I am thinking, do I buy? Do I try and get in? Do I not? And the critical question was, in the old days, there was an idea of getting on at the bottom of the property ladder and clawing your way up over a period of years. But what she's asking is the property ladder now so broken that you just need to sort of make a big jump to try and get on and hang on? Or is it a legitimate strategy to buy small, somewhere out in the sticks or whatever, with the expectation that over time you'll be able to pull your way up the property ladder? So is the property ladder bust, or is it still there, Chris? What do you think?
There might be a ladder, but I don't think it has too many, whatever you call the middle bits
the
in
rung,
the ladder. The rung, there you go. I don't think it has many rungs on it, basically. I mean, the stepping stone strategy, which is, absolutely perpetuated from generations before, is, don't go buy beyond your means, buy something a bit smaller, and then upgrade when you get to the family stage. When you have a second kid, upgrade again and get your 4-bed house. Like, that all makes sense, right, if prices don't run over that period. But the problem is you can see house prices versus apartment prices, better streets and bigger properties versus smaller houses. And it's really hard to outrun fast-moving property markets, right? And so often those people who have maybe been a bit more conservative, bought something a bit cheaper, and then as their incomes go up and they build a bit of equity and they pay their mortgage off and they were conservative and they just focused on paying their mortgage down, didn't do any other investing. When they get to that point in time, once they're paid, the stamp duty on buying, the selling cost, and they have to repay stamp duty again, they haven't been able to keep up. You can't outrun the market. And so it's really hard to do that stepping stone strategy. And that's been amplified over the last 3-4 years. You can see the house prices, how they've been performing versus what often a lot of first home buyers buy, which is, say, apartments, right? And you can see the turnover rate of property. I mean, we used to live in our homes for, say, 7 years, and then we used to upgrade them. What that's, you can see in many suburbs, it's gone to 15 years. It's gone to 20 years in some suburbs. And so what that's basically showing you is that when people do get into a house, they can't afford to make that jump to that next place. And often those jumps are too big, to to go from the smaller 3-bed house to the 4-bed house on a better street is such a big jump. And if you are going to make a jump, pay stamp duty, pay selling costs, it needs to be a meaningful jump. If it's I'm only going to get a little bit more land, do I really want to pay all those costs and the stress and the hassle to get that? And so I think that, the property market's seizing up, and you can see this. If you go back at drop on SQM listings, there's lots of different places you can look at listings, but it's a very easy thing you can do. And you can go back, say, 15 years, all the way back to the 2010s. And you can see the amount of properties that were turning over per year. And that's really supply. Yeah, you've got new properties coming into the market, a couple 100,000 a year. And, we can talk about that, buying those in another conversation if you like, or even today. But the real supply is what you can buy on the market. The amount of people that are willing to sell. Even though there's 11 million properties, good luck trying to buy 11 million. You can probably buy 300,000-400,000 every year, and I think that's getting less every year, right? Because people are getting stuck in properties. Yeah, they'd love a bigger place. They'd love to upgrade, but they just can't afford to do so. And that's even got really hard even in the last few years with the borrowing capacity really restricted, is that, I would love to upgrade and I'm really confident about my future over the next few years with income, and there's going to be income growth. But if I go to borrow money from the bank now, I can borrow 5 times my income, and that's just not enough to do the upgrade, and let alone I haven't got enough equity to do that as well. And so, I think that's just going to keep on happening year after year. We're living longer. That's another reason why, turnover rates getting smaller. Well,
I think that's what I see too. My conversation with Valerie was, I don't think the property ladder works. I think it's almost as if the bottom rung is lifted so far off the ground, and the space between the rungs are so huge now. So it really does beg the question, what is the right strategy if you want to get into the market? And of course, some people are saying, well, I'm being forced to consider a unit, maybe a small unit, maybe closer into town because it's a little cheaper. But when you actually start looking at the costs, it might be a slightly more capital cost that's lower, but the higher strata fees and the ongoing maintenance costs that actually are often wrapped up into those means that from a cash flow perspective, it's not necessarily that much more beneficial. So what it means is you've got relatively small numbers of options for people. There are a small number of standalone properties available, but not very many in the affordable range. Most of them are sort of way too expensive. So it puts a lot of pressure on a relatively small part of the market. And, it really is tough to see how people can find their way through this situation, because there is a limit to where incomes are going to grow. I'm not convinced as some that we're going to see massive income growth in the next 2 or 3 years. The country's productivity is so small that it's unlikely, other than in specific industries, perhaps. Therefore, what do people do, Chris?
Look, it's a good question around the sort of, I do think that Australians are having to make bigger, the picket fence and this 1/4 acre block in a 5 k's from the city might have been realistic, say 30 years ago. Is that realistic in 2025? Probably not, right? And so I think Australians and people living in the capital cities are having to make more compromises than they ever have. And they're willing to make those changes. They've sort of, but they do want security. They do want stability. They do want to live in a place that, is inspiring, that does give them a life that they want to stay in the city, right? And so they are making compromises. I think a lot of people in our capital cities haven't grown up in Australia as well. Obviously due to migration, and they're moving here to study, or they're moving here for work, etc. And they've grown up in not houses on quiet streets in suburbs, right? A lot of them have grown up in apartments, and so they're also willing to make compromises. And so I think the issue comes though is, there's a lot of apartments that were built in the sort of 60s and 70s, and they're Art Deco and they're brick and they're smaller units, and they're usually in sort of premium suburbs, surrounded by low density housing. And then you've got high density apartments that have been built for investors for the last 20 to 30 years, and those buildings were built to be cheap as possible because they were easier to sell, and there's massive building problems there, and there's also massive issues with their growth because they are driven by investment markets, and like you say, issues with strata and defects, etc. So I think you've got to be really careful buying those apartments. I do think the next wave of apartments that are going to get built, and it's really just down to feasibility of developers right now, is they can't build they can't build what current stock is priced at. It's just the cost to build plus the cost to buy the land is more expensive than what the apartments are, right? So to developers to make money right now, and this is why zoning is one thing, but builders will only build, particularly after the last few years where a lot of their risk appetites reduced and their liquidity buffers have reduced, is they'll only build where they can make the project stack up. And so we will see a new wave of apartments getting built, but they'll be really high end and they'll be much more expensive than current apartments, and they'll be targeted downsizers. They'll be, really big 2 beds, 3 beds, potentially 4 beds. There'll be, and there'll be like an alternative to if you can't afford a house, or you're in a house and you want to get out and you want to downsize, this is an alternative type of apartment. But it's really hard for developers to build high density apartments right now. And so, yeah, I would say, with whether you should enter or not, I do think you've got to be really careful buying any high density unit. I think they have benefited from building prices going up and a lack of new supply coming. But I also think that the quality of the asset really is going to deteriorate quite fast. I don't think they were built with longevity in mind, 5-10 years ago. And so, but if you are, I think people are still going to want security and stability in the future. I think there was a lot of reports, say 5-10 years ago, is that the next generation will just live in a share economy, rent investing for life. And I think that's sort of been, when you look at all the reports, the next generation want to own a home or an apartment more than just as much as every other generation. And you can see the amount of pent up demand in property markets. The ownership rate, every time that reduces, it doesn't mean that people don't want to buy. It's just been they haven't been able to buy. And so, say 70% of people own houses, properties, say, 20, 30 years ago. I haven't got the stats in front of me, but, let's say it's 60% now. Well, that doesn't mean that 10% don't want to buy. They just haven't been able to enter yet. Yeah.
Well, those numbers are scary, right? So if you look at it, we've got more people in the rental sector as a proportion of the total population than ever before. We've got more people with a property with a mortgage than ever before. And that mortgage is 1, taken on later, 2, for a more extended period, and 3, into old age. So we've got a huge proportion of the population who are actually mortgaged up to the gills. And in some cases, the debt to income ratios on there are, significantly higher than they were a few years ago, as you said earlier. And then you've got another cohort of people who own outright, but the proportion of people who own outright is going down. Right? Not up, it's going down. And of course, those who own outright are also in a bit of a conundrum because they might want to downsize, but they can't find anything sensible to downsize to. So they're actually blocking those properties that might otherwise come on the market. So, wherever you look, you can see that this is not working, but it's not been working right for at least 20 years. You and I have been chatting about this for 6, 7, 8 years now, whatever. It has not changed fundamentally. The same dynamics that we had then, government support, banks lending more, high demand, high migration, even high migration recently, have created this multi-generational problem. And I look at it 2 ways, Chris. Firstly, there is a political and social failure over a generation plus. But I also look at it from the point of view of individuals trying to work out what to do and how to get into the market. And it's getting more and more complex and difficult for those people to try and make sensible decisions. And, in my one-to-one conversations, sometimes I have to say to people, well, just understand you will probably have to reach to the absolute limit to be able to buy almost anything. And you'll probably buy a poor quality asset in not a very good place. And it won't be a very good investment, but if you want to buy in, that's probably what you can afford. And don't think that property investment is necessarily going to be great for you as it was for the previous generation, because the parameters have somewhat changed now. And whilst there might be some rises in value, they probably won't be as strong as we had. Post-COVID, that was a stupid, massive hike because of poor government policy. So it really is complex for people who are actually, on that first rung. But I'd also argue, Chris, that it's complex for people further up the rungs too, who are trying to work out what to do. And some of the downsizers and some of the upsizers. I've had a conversation recently with a one-on-one family who are relatively affluent, but they're absolutely stuck in this small place that they bought about 5 or 6 years ago. And, it's not in a bad place, but it's too small and they can't extend it. But they can't afford to go upscale. So they're stuck too. So almost where you look across this spectrum, I see nothing but problems.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So that's the couple with the kids stuck in the apartment, right? The person they want to move into a smaller house. That's a family with 2 teenage kids in it that want to move into a bigger house, and then in the bigger house is the widow or the couple with the kids, the empty nesters, and the kids come maybe once or twice a year, if that, and they don't want to downsize because they can't find something in their area because they don't want to leave their area. They've also got so much emotional attachment to the home. It's a tax-free asset growth, and it stops them. If they did sell, maybe they would, give that money to the kids, or they would, maybe have to not get the pension, etc. So, and a lot of them don't want to downsize out of the properties. I mean, particularly if they don't downsize in that sort of that window when confidence is high, and they maybe leave it a little bit too late, and they're a bit fearful to go to a smaller place. And so, yeah, absolutely. It makes sense to reallocate, our housing stock to what our actual country's needs are. But that's people's lives and that's people's properties. It doesn't mean that people are going to, even though they've got spare bedrooms, sell their properties. And particularly when they know they're good assets. And it's also not incentive for the kids. If the kids don't need the money, they want to keep mum and dad in the property because they know when they do pass along one day, then that money will come to them. If they do downsize, you think, oh, that's great. It's a family for a property, a house for the family to move up into. But that creates another transaction. So it's a debt creating event. The person who's in the smaller house takes on more debt to buy the new house. The person in the apartment takes on more debt to upgrade to the house. And maybe there's another apartment on the market that a first home buyer buys. So yeah, great. But often when that person downsizes, what do they do with their excess cash? Well, they give it to their kids and then their grandkids. And then that money usually flows back into the property market. Whether the couple that's maybe a bit older, they keep living in their place, maybe they renovate, maybe they pay off the mortgage. If they pay off the mortgage, maybe they buy an investment property. And so this sort of mental accounting is that, and it's particularly even when people do well in business or, people buy lifestyle, right? And so a lot of that wealth that's created in other asset classes flows itself back into property. So obviously this Trump issue in the last month with the trade wars, at times of uncertainty, does property do well? Yeah, it does. It's seen as the safe haven, and people sort of batten down the hatches, and so there's all these things that force wealth back into property. And while a lot of people argue, oh, get rid of stamp duty, right, and go to land tax. Well, all that will do will encourage people to transact more, and when they transact more, they'll borrow more money. The person who has got a small mortgage compared to their income right now would love to upsize, doesn't want to digest the stamp duty costs. If you say you don't have to pay stamp duty, yeah, they'll happily take on another $500,000 or $1 million of debt to make that upgrade. And so, there's you cut negative gearing. Okay, great. Well, you're going to create less investment, and then you might create a rental shortage in locations, and you've got a rental crisis. And does that encourage more people to want to buy? So there's not one little thing or one little change. And a lot of the issues do stem from not be building enough properties, but that's just not as simple as zoning. But I do think it's brave what the New South Wales government have done, and they've really taken on NIMBYs and they're taken on councils, and have been pretty brave with some legislation and how they're changing planning policy.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? And I was looking at this the other day. I'll just find this one here. This is the Parramatta Road story. So, there's an inner city council fighting an $880 million proposal to build more than 1,000 apartments on Parramatta Road because of the fact that the transport system doesn't actually work too well. And 2 issues, 1 solution: how housing on Parramatta Road can fix ongoing crisis and bring the precinct back to life. So you can see the 2 sides of the argument, right? So on one hand, the state says we need to build high, and Parramatta Road's a great place. On the other hand, there are other people saying, well, hang on a moment, just think about the consequences with the people living next door, et cetera, et cetera. And it just shows you that there's no overall winners. There's some winners and some losers on almost all of these things. And interestingly, the more I talk to people who are just outside the 800-meter limit, well, why isn't my property, if they can do it down the road, why can't I do it? Why can't I knock down and rebuild? So they've built these little zones around the transport hubs and things. So you're not going to please all the people, are you?
Look, I think it's just an insight on where we're heading, right? So If a lot of people would say, oh, close the borders. I can see some comments here, and don't import people and talent. But then we've got skill shortages. We need more construction workers, let's call it, and let alone and the amount of money it brings into our economy and tourism and students, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that simple, right? And we have a model. Are we going to change that model massively? We could maybe reduce the intake for a couple of years, but are we going to go back to? And this is what in COVID it was a lot of migration's not going to come. Property prices are going to fall. And there was an argument that there's just going to be catch up, and what's happened over the last few years is that catch up, etc. So, the pro-development thing and NIMBYism has been pretty strong, and in a lot of affluent areas they've had little communities and little groups, and if there was a DA that people didn't like, then they were very good at lodging lots of objections, and a lot of those objections and speaking to local council members to fight those and push it all the way through the court. But it seems like that tide's turning a little bit, and I think if you do own an asset right now, you've got to sort of think if there is major changes to planning controls, and they're not doing it everywhere across our cities, but they are doing it around transport hubs, and Parramatta Road, in my mind, is a great spot to be building more housing or properties for people. You just got to be careful. How would your property, either benefit or be affected by that? If you've got a heritage place in an area where everything else isn't heritage and you can't knock down your house, but you're going to have high rises around you, then that could be a problem. If you're going to be just outside those zones and you're going to have high rises, then that could either be a good thing. It could be good for the livability, but it could also be quite bad if you're backing onto it. You got to look at places like Box Hill in Melbourne, where you've got single-story houses against 30-story high rises. But I don't think the alternative is a good option. I think there's a massive society problem what we're getting in our cities, and if our cities become undesirable, then talent won't move here, right? And they'll go other places in the world, whether it's because we're in a global economy, right? So I think the city has to come up with solutions in terms of Sydney. I think other cities will have this problem as well. And no more housing and NIMBYism, I don't think is going to stack up long term.
No, and you make the interesting point there about the international context here. Of course, there are people internationally still looking at Australia saying, well, it's a really attractive place, and with the exchange rate where it is, I've got money, I can bring it into Australia, and I can actually afford to buy. That's part of the story. We've also got a lot of people who are locally struggling, and there's a worry about people not being able to live in the Sydney region and having to go to other places because maybe it's a little bit less expensive. But actually, if you look at incomes, they're also lower, so it doesn't necessarily solve too much at all. And if you look at WA, WA is an example where you've had a booming economy, huge migration in, property prices through the roof, rentals all over the place. So it doesn't necessarily solve anything. So, we are in this situation, and it's interesting just standing back and thinking about it, where there are no simple solutions. There are no obvious levers. But one I think I would like to explore briefly is the old negative gearing and CGT discounts. This was actually a tweet I saw from Oliver in WA. $283 billion projected to go over the next few years up to 2035 for negative gearing support and CGT discounts. And of course, the major parties have pretty much said, well, we're not going to touch that. Only the Greens are talking about it. And it's interesting, Chris, that if the Greens actually hold the balance of power after the election, which is possible given the latest polls, I might touch on that in a second, they might be able to actually start negotiating around the negative gearing and CGT discounts as part of the horse trading. Or indeed, they might do another one. This is the question of the imputed capital gains, the unrealized capital gains, which of course is floating around the superannuation sector at the moment. But is this going to be something which could be more widely done, and could the Greens be partly responsible for that, because that's something that they would perhaps support too? So there's some interesting and complex situations here with regard to what levers might get pulled because of a potential coalition.
Yeah, so I think when you change the incentive, you change behaviour, right? I mean, I'm not the wise man that once said that, and that's true, right? If you do change tax settings and you make certain investments more desirable than others, you will change behaviour. So if you limit the cap on super that you don't have to worry about this, let's say go from 3 million down to 2 million and unrealised that's gains, you're absolutely going to try to force people to take more money out of super. And that's the whole idea of it. But what do people do with that money? Do they pay off their homes? Do they upgrade their home into an asset that grows tax-free? Do they buy investment properties? They put in markets. The money's got to go somewhere. Do they pass it down to their kids? And the kids then leverage it up and buy assets. And so you will change behavior. And I absolutely think that that policy in itself would exactly the same would happen if you remove negative gearing. Does it mean that people aren't going to do investing for their future and retirement? Well, no, they're probably going to put more money into super. They're probably going to upgrade their home. And instead of buying an investment property, they might still take on that extra $1 million of debt, but they might do it into a tax-free asset in a home. What would be the impact on that with our rental supply? You'd have to say that less investors, and if more investors don't get replaced with the investors that are bailing, because there's always investors selling, right? Death, divorce, getting older, just financially they need to. So there's always investors exiting the market if they're not getting replaced, which has kind of been proven over the last 2 years. If you look at PIPA, as in a Property Investment Professionals Association, they've done a few big surveys over the last couple of years, and you can really see that a lot of investors have bailed, and you can see that within our rental markets. And so you've got to be really careful playing around with the and you can see in Victoria, particularly with a lot of anti-investment policies, land tax changes, tenancy rules. I'm for a lot of this stuff as well. And that changes behavior. And so, I think the unintended consequences are probably bigger than people expect. And they don't just naturally think that prices are going to fall if you go and remove negative gearing. Doesn't mean that the demand for property is going to change. And in areas where there's lots of investors, you might say, right, that could change prices. But in areas where there's a lot of owner-occupied demand, I think you've just increased it, if I'm honest. Now, changing the capital gains tax, will investors really not buy an investment property if they have to pay a bit more capital gains tax in the future? Probably not. They probably would still buy. And in particular, if it's also on shares, it's like, well, I can't put any more money into super. I can buy shares. Well, I'm going to pay capital gains tax on that. If I buy a property, I'm going to pay capital gains tax on that. You're just going to be a little bit extra anti-investor, but I don't think that would change investment behavior too much. The negative gearing benefits do go up and down over time. Obviously, when interest rates are high, but that number reduces, and it's a big conversation. I just think that a lot of people are looking for an easy way out and thinking, if I change that means that prices, but a negative gearing benefits in some areas are having zero effect on prices. If a suburb's owned 80, 90% by owner-occupiers, what's driving that market isn't investors using negative gearing. What's driving it is strong owner-occupier demand, whereas some area markets that are driven by a lot of investors, and maybe it's 80, 90% investors, negative gearing would affect that area. But also it's also providing rental housing, and you've got to have both.
Yeah, and this is interesting, of course, that politicians are quite well invested in property, and probably some of them are negatively geared, as you perhaps would expect. So they might have a little bit of an interest in not seeing that removed. But I also think you make a really good point that it doesn't impact the whole of the market equally, and there are areas of the market where there's almost no negative gearing, but others parts of the market where it's a very significant element. So it might just shift the dial. It won't necessarily solve it. It might just move the problem, as it were. And I'd argue another example of that will be the Greens and their rent freezes. Of course, in ACT, there's a limit on how much rents can be put up. And the Greens are saying we should apply that more widely. And it's true to say that rental increases in the ACT have been somewhat lower. But of course, in the ACT, incomes are a whole lot higher. So in fact, people are still able to, work it, whereas in other places, not so much. So I'm not convinced necessarily that even trying to freeze rents or hold rents at a lower level increase will necessarily solve a problem either.
Well, you can definitely do it at a state level, and investors are sort of borderless now. Whether they should be or not is another conversation, but there were a lot of home bias from investors in the past. A little bit their attitudes towards investing is shifting. And the last few years, we've absolutely seen a huge shift. For example, even in Bath, a lot of people would go to their capital cities, or they would buy where they currently own their home. They would see a property a couple of streets away when they're walking the dog and go, I need an investment property, and would buy it without looking at the other 10 million properties on the market. Or unfortunately, they'll go to an investment seminar and get signed up by some property spruiker selling some off-the-plan apartment, etc. And so a lot of investors are sort of going into regional towns and lower price points, A, because that's all they can borrow. B, the yields are a little bit higher as a percentage, and with interest rates being a bit higher, they've gone there. And so if you change negative gearing, that behavior would still stay the same. And so, yeah, I've actually just forgot your question, Martin. Where are we going there? I apologize. It's getting 9 o'clock and 2 young kids. I'm using this time is like second tea time, and so what was the question again, Martin? Sorry.
No, I think you covered. Let's move on just briefly. I want to do 2 things. One is just to give people that's the updated news poll. So 34 to Labour, 35 to the Coalition. The Greens are 11, One Nation 8, 12 other. So the others are going to have quite a voice, and you can see there's a bit of movement there. So what happens with the smaller parties is going to be quite interesting, and I think that's one to watch. I wanted to move the conversation forward, though, on 2 fronts. The first is I've had the chance over the recent weeks to talk specifically with some people who are in the process of trying to get their own home built and are having all sorts of problems with the inability of the builder to build in line with the specification, in line with what the surveyor is, so basically they go around in these circles. I actually made a show about it called the New Build Property Con. And it seems to me that this is probably one of the biggest issues that isn't really being spoken about. Although actually, I must say, the ABC just published a show and a report saying, here's an example of a builder collapsing, leaving with costly repairs to make property saleable. His insurance claim has been delayed for years and he could face bankruptcy. This is not a minor example. I'm seeing quite a few of these where we've got a real problem with the building and construction sector, builders trying to cut corners, the self-certification process is not working, the government-backed building and construction entities around the country not doing their job. And so people are being left with a half-built, half-finished place they can't actually sell. And so it begs the question, even if you decide to go the build route, are you stuck there too? What do you think?
Look, I mean, the Productivity Commission, I think it was, did a report on, and I think a lot of professions probably maybe need to be a bit more productive with their time each week and each month. And I think we've, this is a global problem, and I don't think Australia's or the building industry's standing out dramatically, right? But I don't think we, and you can see in the last couple of years some huge building issues with companies going under, and I've got a lot of I guess, empathy to them. A lot of them got caught out with fixed price contracts. It was really hard. They're running on really tight margins. A lot of people think the builders were creaming it and taking so much profits, and developers, I don't think they were. And a lot of them have been put out of business. And, a lot of them have committed to contracts that just don't make sense. And they've had issues with weather and so many different things the building industry's had over the last few years. And I think that, whether you're doing a renovation, you're doing a big build, you're buying a house and land package, you're buying an off-the-plan apartment, you're buying a townhouse development, a lot of them are getting delayed. A lot of them builders are, one projects might be doing okay, but other projects aren't. A lot of builders are going under, etc. And so I do think it's a major problem. And, that's why I think a lot of our clients don't want to do renos. A lot of them don't want to do builds. Because they want that stability and I guess confidence to know that they can afford it. And a lot of them can't afford it, to be honest. But I don't think there's a shortage of work for the building industry. When you look at what's happening with the Olympics, government spending, government infrastructure, the commercial market as well, and towers, it's not like we've got a building problem, and we've actually got probably the opposite, a shortage of trades. And I don't think builders are going to want to reduce their prices either. And so, while, yeah, absolutely, consumers are losing out here, and protections from builders are not what you think they are. But I do think it's a common story. Whether you've had builders go under through the build, I've seen that more than ever in the last 2 or 3 years. Clients come back when they're doing renos saying, I was promised X amount and, I'm spending 40, 50% more. That's very common. And some people can afford to do it, and some people are, finding every dollar they can to make it work. And renovations are often always underestimated going in. You never have any idea of how much it's going to cost until you really start. And or until you finish, to be honest, because there's always costs that just keep on adding up. Yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, the conversation I've had recently has been with people who thought they were covered and weren't. And then the other side of it is in the sort of the final stage of the construction, there are often little clauses in the contract where they basically say, well, you've confirmed that the property has been built to specification, you've confirmed that there are no defects, right? So the builder is trying to get the homeowner to certify that the property is up to spec. I don't know how a homeowner can possibly know that.
Yeah. Look, I think it's and I do, like I said before, I do think that it's not an interest for a builder to go under on a project as well, right? And so, I think that I've had clients who have maybe been a bit too aggressive with how they've negotiated for renovations, for example, and they've had builders go under, and they've had to then go back and appoint a new builder, and they don't want to protect themselves because they're kind of taking over someone else's work, etc. And so, but in the contracts, etc. But they take on a lot of risk as well. So while you could say the consumer's taking on a bit of risk here, I think the builders are as well. And a lot of them have been burnt heavily over the last couple of years and been put out of business.
Absolutely. And people are talking about VBA, the Victorian Building Supervisor there, because that seems to be a particular problem. Actually, interestingly, I've had more conversations about the ACT than anybody else in recent times. So there's a problem in the ACT as well, which is quite interesting. So Chris, I guess we've highlighted some of the issues. You are having conversations with individuals trying to actually put together a deal to help them buy something. This must be quite a complicated conversation to have with them. And I know you highlight in your, broker offering, this is a life conversation, not just a transactional conversation, right? So take us through some of the things that you want to table when you have a conversation with a prospective client who comes to you and say, I'm thinking of buying, I need a mortgage.
Yeah, it is often a bit of a surprise to clients, and it comes from our origin as financial advisors. And once you've sort of got that type of training, you can't switch it off, right? And I think it's really important to go through that sort of same thinking when you're entering the property market. You really need to think through, how does this fit into my longer term plan? And so the questions you really want to be asking, and not many brokers do ask these questions. I think they should, and they will be better brokers if they do. But obviously, it's just around a lot of life planning. Where are you living now? What do you do for work? What's your plans with work? Have you got a partner? Are you thinking about having kids? Would you stay living where you are? Would you move closer to family? Would you have more than one kid? Was there family to help you? What would you go with childcare? Where would you go to schools? And a lot of these are big conversations. And, often a lot of people are making property decisions based on what they need today or what they maybe need for the next few years. And, with that stepping stone strategy in mind, and, she'll be right, and I just need to get something, and I need to get out of the rental market, and I don't want to rent again. And they're sort of rushing it as well. There's a lot of pressure in society. It's not just with media, but friends, family, work colleagues, anxiety they've personally got just by reading negative news for so many years. And when they finally get ready, they rush it. And they just try to get a property, just thinking that, all 11 million properties grow at the same rate. And often they sign up to a development or an offer plan or a, house and land package. And, and once you're in, you're in. And, often a lot of people, if there's a confirmation bias and years down the line, they go, oh, I probably should have spent more time thinking through what I bought. And maybe I shouldn't have bought that one bed apartment. And maybe we should have just bought a bit further out of town. And, maybe I shouldn't have bought that new townhouse. Maybe I should have bought the older house and then renovated when I could afford it. Or maybe I shouldn't have bought that cheap investment property regionally. I should have just waited an extra 6 months and maybe bought a 2-bed apartment and, maybe thought, I made more compromises. Maybe I should have just, accepted that maybe what I want and what I can buy is just not going to happen. And if the fundamentals change, i.e. my income goes up or borrowing capacity goes up, maybe waiting's not going to get me any closer to my dreams. And I think these are the sort of conversations that we sort of have to have. And so you're going in eyes wide open, you're really thinking through. And then I think when people have, got pre-approvals, there's a lot of things that people don't know around structuring loans and, it's education. A lot of people think, oh, I'll just go for a 20% deposit, and they ignore 95% deposit schemes, or they, using LMI, or, benefits of using guarantor loans. They don't structure their loans the right way. They maybe, take a smaller LVR because it feels better, a smaller mortgage, but then they don't have any buffer, or they haven't thought through, restructuring their investment properties, etc. So a lot of loan structuring advice. And once we figured out what's the right, structure, giving them confidence around, different mortgage and different spending amounts and, their buffers, then they go, I've got a pre-approval. But then going out and buying just isn't that simple, right? Like, where do you start? Do you just go on the portals? Do you just go to open homes? And so we do a lot of education around, okay, well, if you are going to spend, this is the type of asset that would do better than others. We're not going and saying you should buy this property on this street, but we have a property philosophy. And then once we know the area that they're buying, we have, relationships with over 40 different companies in terms of buyer's agents that we refer to. We don't do that for a financial benefit. We just go, well, if you're going to buy in the northern beaches of Sydney, maybe you should speak to this couple of buyer's agents. Or if you're going in the, you're buying regionally, then this could be a good option for you. It's working with different companies. Then usually buyers agents have been doing it 5-10 years minimum. They're running small businesses, and they've got little teams around them, and they've got a lot of local knowledge in those marketplaces, rather than the plethora of new to industry buyers agents that have entered in the last couple of years. And so it is a different process. What we're really trying to do is get a client for life, and really be a trusted advisor and a sounding board for clients, rather than, hey, come to us, tell us your income, how much cash you got. We'll tell you how much money you can borrow and who's going to give you a good rate. Like, that's broking 101. I think that there's a much bigger game that brokers can play in your life. And then we bring in other advisors if we need, whether it's, financial advice or insurance, or et cetera, along the way.
It's interesting because I saw on your website there the alcove approach. So trusted advisors is the key thread there. Ex-financial advisors and accountants, tailored to your own life and property plans. It's fundamentally different to other brokers. So that begs the question then: what do other brokers do?
Look, and this is not a shot at brokers. There's 20-odd thousand of them. And the broking industry has been a big success. Like, you cannot argue, and consumers shouldn't be arguing with the broking industry. And that sounds very biased, and it sounds very self-fulfilling. But ultimately, you only have to look at net interest margins from the banks and the desire for banks to kill brokers. And the reason is that brokers are creating more competition in the mortgage market. And banks have been playing on customer apathy for decades. You just got to type in loyalty tax, and you'll find that there's thousands of articles on basically banks taking advantage of existing customers and not passing on what they're offering to new customers to existing customers. And so when you go to a broker, and we refinance you to a new bank, we're moving you to a better rate, so you're less profitable to that bank. And broker market share wouldn't be going up year on year on year if consumers weren't getting a good outcome. And you can see through complaints through financial ombudsman, etc. The broker markets, customers of brokers are usually quite happy. And so not to say that I just think there's another game that brokers need to step up to. I think once you've got more knowledge, I think you become educated, and just sort of taking the easy route, and maybe just giving clients what they want, maybe not challenging them and saying, hang on a sec, there's probably more you need to know and understand before you enter the market, and taking that sort of role as more of an advisor rather than a facilitator or a validator. And then also when you're entering the market, I mean, if people are going into debt, I do think they need a bit of an education on what they're going to spend that money on. And as a lot of brokers, unfortunately, just don't have this knowledge. I think they've tried to just stay in their lane, and there's something to be said in that, in a way. And I'm going to focus on making sure I can get loans approved. I'm going to give clients a good customer experience and customer service, and brokers do that. And I'm going to get them a good rate, so I'm going to find them a good deal. I'm not going to then focus on actually what they're going to go and do with the money. But I think once you've got a bit of property knowledge, you need to sort of call out things that you think clients are making, bad decisions, or could be making better decisions, and challenge their thinking. And we're often doing that. We're saying, have you thought through this? If you do this, this could be the consequence. This is an alternative strategy for you to consider. There's trade-offs and pros and cons, but at least, stopping and having that conversation. A lot of people, for example, might own a home or an apartment and they'll go and buy an investment property without thinking the unintended consequences when they want to upgrade their home in a few years' time. And the stress in doing so and the difficulty in doing so. And there's lots of other case studies of where people could maybe think about options they're not considering.
So my take out of that, Chris, is that, there are many brokers who will see a transaction as a point in time, right? But there's a broader context here. Life is not just a point in time, but it actually has consequences and implications later. And therefore, the decisions that you take at a point in time need to be thought about over that slightly broader period. I wonder to what extent you find that the prospective purchaser wants to go down that route, knows enough to be able to go down that route, or do they say, all I want is a loan? No. What's the hit rate?
It's an interesting one. We just have a process, right? And we will follow that process. And if clients don't want to buy into it, that's okay. They might say, look, just get me a loan, etc. But I don't know. We want clients for life. We want clients who just see and the value the advice we do. End of the day, they might have a view of what's the best thing to do for them, and that might be what they end up doing, and that might be the best thing. But if we can give them some options that they might want to consider, and I think that's where when you work with any professional in your life, I think the ones that actually challenge your thinking are the ones that are probably adding value, the ones that are just doing what you want them to do. Yeah, they are validating and they're doing what you want, and that's great. But are they even pointing out some blind spots or challenges with your current strategy? And when you're seeing, we've probably settled collectively maybe $2 billion, probably done like $1.4 billion. So it's a lot of clients, right? And that we've seen. And that's that doesn't include all the conversations we've had with clients that haven't been clients, strategies that we've done, first calls, etc. So it's a lot of people. And when you speak to clients and you say, oh, you bought that property, when did you buy that? Okay. And what was it? What's the address? Okay, right. All right, that one hasn't done too well. Oh, you bought that property there. Okay, let's have a look at that one. Oh, that's actually done really well, hasn't it? And okay. And you've gone down that strategy, you bought 4 here. Okay, so you just pick up all these learnings. And that's pretty much what I did for many years, is just individually look at every single property that clients owned and bought. And you just build all these reference points and you start to build, well, that's actually worked for these clients. And it hasn't worked in these scenarios. And you start to hear more and more of the horror stories. I mean, I've got another podcast, Elephant in the Room. We've been doing that for 8 years. We've had close to 400 guests on that. And you just pick up all these learnings. And I think that's just what we're trying to do, is pass those learnings on to our clients. Clients value that. And then they stay with us for life. They refer to us, and that's what grows our business. And ultimately, they're setting themselves up for the future and their families.
You may have heard the dogs there. The bins are being collected. Yeah, very interesting. And welcome to real life. We've changed the hours. You see, we're now 2 hours different than where we were. So it's not so early. So that means the dogs are more likely to bark. Chris, well, coming into the show, I guess I had 2 final questions for you. The first one was, what's your sense of what the market will do over the next few months? We do expect some cuts in rates. I'm not as convinced as many that we're going to see the rates come down anywhere near as fast as the markets were actually suggesting. I think that the inflation is still pretty sticky, and it's interesting that the most recent data about inflation expectations from the Roy Morgan was that actually people are saying, well, 5.1% could well be the inflation rate. That's the current expectation. Interestingly, consumer confidence also dropped as well, which tells you something quite interesting about what's going on. So what's your perspective in terms of expectations with regard to the market?
Look, I do think there's this desire to see multiple rate cuts. You could see, even Narita at Ray White just did an article, I think it was today, around what they've just seen in terms of price growth. And I think you'll start to see the totality. I agree with you, Martin. As someone who's changed these names multiple times, I actually quite like the CoreLogic name. So I don't really get the totality. But, I think you'll see in the monthly news, and that's not a shot at Eliza. Eliza's a good friend of mine. Not she had anything to do with the name change probably, but I think you'll find that price growth will be there. I do think that there has been an increase in urgency and buyer confidence. And that's what we see, right? We see clients come back to us that have, a prime example, client bought this week, $1.6 million in Sydney. We did a strategy for them in 2023. They went quiet, ghosted us. That often happens in the market. People get interested. It all becomes too much. They maybe try to buy, they get pre-approved, then they fall out. Life takes over. Another priority comes, and because it's quite tiring. But often when they come back into the market, they come back with a bit of venom. And so we can see when older buyers are coming back because they've just been doing it for so long. And I think that that's absolutely there. But I also think people really want to see those rate cuts. So I think there has actually been a stemming increase in borrowers or desire to buy over the last couple of months or whenever that last rate cut was. I don't think it's been a massive flood. I do think though, if we start to see 2, 3, 4, 5, or maybe not 5, but 2 or 3, I think that will give buyers a lot of confidence. And if you then on top of that add in the plans around the 5% deposit, I think a Labor's dollar something. I'm not going to get political, but it's very low dollars in terms of where the money is. Not to say they've got it right. They've got Trump and Brexit massively wrong, the money markets. But let's say Labor win the election, the 5% deposit scheme is starting in January. I think a lot of buyers want to get ahead of that. That's a massively increase in demand. And so if you were trying to buy a property, you'd want to be buying before January, because that's if you could, rather than waiting till January when you'll be competing with a lot more first home buyers. So I would say, whether you want to say rates are going to be high for longer and inflation's not getting back in the bottle, and yet you can have that argument. And if you want to have that argument, you could say, well, I'm going to sit out and I'm just going to wait for rates to fall. If you're wrong and rates do fall, and there's also pressure for banks' innovation and APRA to step in, and borrowing capacities go up a lot in this market where listings you can hardly say are very high. I think you'll find that demand increases dramatically on a small number of listings. And I think that's a similar case to 2019. I think when Labor lost the elections, Liberal won, rate cuts, APRA stepped in, confidence returns, and confidence returns on a small number of properties on the market. And we haven't got this flood of properties, and properties are just, not transacting, etc. They're very tight markets, particularly in the housing markets. That's just the danger. If demand increases on a small number of properties and there's a FOMO that kicks into markets, all of a sudden you go to an auction and you think, I'm going to buy this place for $1 million. That place goes for 1.1 million, right? And then what do you want? You still got $1 million budget. What you do is you don't want to, you go look at a property that should be selling at $1 million, that sells for $1.50 million. You start chasing the market and your desire just to buy. And that's what happens. Markets can move quite fast. Once people miss out a few times and they feel like they're going to miss out, then they want to transact. And so if we come back and we talk in 2-3 months and there's a few more rate cuts, you're going to also find that markets are quite seasonally. A lot of people don't want to sell in winter. It makes sense. We've just come out of the school holidays, but a lot of properties will not want to hit the market in June. So we've maybe got like 3-4 weekends of listings come on, but I would say there's more than enough demand pent up, and then you're going to see markets really dry up in July, and then new listings will come up in August. Now, August is a long time away, I would say, and you could see sentiment change dramatically. Or you might not, but it's not such a guaranteed either way which it's going to go.
No, very good. Well, and then the final point I wanted to ask you on the way, and I want to put this metric sheet up. So the dwelling value to income ratio is at 8.4 relative to long term of 6.7. The percentage of income to service a new mortgage is at 50.5% relative to long term of 36.8. The years to save for a 20% deposit is 10.6 years compared to 9 long term. And the percentage of income required to pay the rent is at 32.9% compared with 29. These are figures from CoreLogic and ANU. And I would highlight, Chris, these are based on the annual gross household income, right? So that's two things. That's before you have to pay tax, which of course has continued to rise, and also the fact that it's multiple incomes. So we are off the chart based on any of those metrics, which begs the question. In fact, that was the poll question that I asked. And it was this: do you think Australian property prices will ever become affordable again? And in the chat, we had 19% saying yes, 67% no, and 14% don't really know which way it's going to go. So I ask you the same question, Chris. Do you think Australian property prices will ever become affordable again?
Look, I think the what you think's normal can always shift, right? You look at the AI at the moment. I think I guess I've learned more about that in the last few months, and what you think's possible can change. I think the new normal, where what people think's expensive today will get expensive tomorrow. I think these problems with housing haven't been at 2025. You could go back and look at 2015. People say the prices were out of control, and they're way past what people can afford. I think those metrics are pretty been proven that they just don't. If you say, oh well, prices times income just doesn't make sense. It means it's going to fall down to a big. Not everyone's buying with a big mortgage. Look at countries around the world. That's nowhere near multiples of incomes of other places around the world. The percentage of, in terms of interest cost of your mortgage repayment versus price of properties. Well, yeah, that's because we are under, I guess, a contractionary, high interest rates right now. And also, I would say that a lot of people haven't got those mortgages. I mean, there are people who leveraged up quite hard in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. And have been surprised by higher interest rates. A lot of them, and some of them have downsized. A lot of them have had to sell investment properties, and absolutely, and a lot of them have hung on, and a lot of them have had income growth that have. And when rates do drop, if let's say they do, then they're going to get more and more manageable. And they're not going to be forced to sell. If they can see that there's a window and there's another side of this, every rate cut gives them more confidence to hold. And I think not many people are thinking about that as well. If you find that a lot of investors will not want to get rid of their investment properties if there's momentum in the market. And so you could see listings actually stay quite tight over the next 6 months, because a lot of investors decide just to hold on and ride the wave for the next few years rather than bail because they can't afford the cash flow, and they can afford it more and more as rates go down. So, I don't think that's unless you see a massive cut to migration, unemployment goes through the roof, and we can build for fun and we build a lot more supply. I just don't think that those fundamental factors are going to shift.
I think it does come back to a recession. If we get a recession here or globally, that could change the game. But then you have rate cuts anyway. And we still have a fundamental shortage of property relative to demand. We've got high migration, and there's no real evidence that the government's going to dial back migration. So, unless things go really pear-shaped, and my modeling also shows this, there is more upside to property, which is not good news for those people trying to get in. For those people in the market at the moment, don't worry, your property prices will probably stay high and continue to grow a little, so you won't be losing that paper profit. But I do think the economic and social consequences of this 20 to 40 year madness is going to bite at some point. And it's a question of when and if and how, which is why I don't believe that in the short term we're going to find that houses are more affordable. I suspect in the longer term we will get an event. I don't know what it will be, and maybe there'll be a bit of a reset, but don't hold your breath.
Yeah, I think that our structure of our property market is going to shift a lot, though. I think that we are going to build a lot more when maybe the government stops spending money, and we potentially build up a bit, get a bit more productive on how we can build properties as well. Technology's going to impact lots of industries, and hopefully it improves the way that we build as well. And I think that NIMBYism is probably going to change as well. And so I do think we're going to build a lot more apartments in our capital cities, and the missing middle, and so I do think there's hope, right? I do think that's a good thing, but that doesn't mean that you're still going to be able to go and buy the house on the quiet street. There's going to be little sanctuaries around the city that every time a new apartment goes up, often they're knocking down houses, and the number of housing stock isn't increasing; it's decreasing every year. And people are living in those properties longer and longer, aren't going to want to sell them because they know they're good assets, and so the ability to buy houses is actually going to get harder. And there are apartments and in our townhouses in some of these what I call sanctuaries around the capital city that whether they're leafy, they've got lots of nature, whether they're just not really close to the train stations, there's going to be pockets where maybe they've got undulating land and it doesn't really make sense to build on, or water issues, etc. There's going to be certain pockets that they don't build on, and houses that are a great place to live and provide all the livability and lifestyle benefits that families want, and they're going to become rarer and rarer. But I do think we are going to build a lot more of the coming decades, and hopefully and developers will want to do that, right? And there's a lot of money for the governments in that space. It's just right now the feasibility doesn't make sense, and until it does, they won't build. And so and the way it is going to make sense is either building costs decrease, unlikely, or prices increase. And so it's not until prices go up that they're going to start building.
It's interesting because Otto says there is hope, according to Chris, but it's not clear what that means. And I have to say, I am less hopeful than you are, Chris, with regard to what's going on at the moment. It seems to me that we've laid the foundations for a social and economic disaster, and we're seeing it beginning to play out as I expected it would. And unfortunately, the politicians don't want to change it. So we're going to see more, the same of the same. Meanwhile, people are going to have to make individual decisions to try and find somewhere to live and somewhere to buy and somewhere to hold. And so the property market will continue to sort of tick over. But I don't think the trajectory is going to change dramatically because I don't think anybody really wants it to change.
Yeah, maybe there's not the hope to buy something, maybe it's not what you think you were going to buy when you were a kid. And but I do think people are going to make more and more compromises, and I think that is the solution. I just don't think there's this, and I don't think that property ladder really exists unless you've got massive intergenerational wealth or ridiculously high income. You're able to make those leaps, and that means the market's going to freeze up because everyone's going to have their house. This is my forever home. I'm going to live here for the next 40 years, or that might be an apartment, and so. And that desire to sort of build massive portfolios, and I'm going to build my wealth through property. I just don't think and I think people are going to have debt longer than ever, and people are going to take debt into their retirement. And so maybe the consequence is they have to sell that apartment or that house when they get to retirement and buy something much smaller. But these are the pivots that are going to naturally happen. Maybe they're going to have to live with friends and family, and multi-generational homes will be the new norm. I think we've seen that. With clients, I've had brothers and sisters buy houses together, even if they've got kids. I've had 3 generations buying houses together. I think that's going to happen more and more. But it's not the system that exists in the 90s or the 2000s or the 2010s isn't going to be the same in 2030. It's just going to shape and morph into a different way. Home equity schemes wouldn't have been dreamed of 5-10 years ago. They're now, all the governments are offering them. Getting access to super for property you wouldn't have thought that. Tax deductible mortgages wouldn't have been thought that. 40-year loans, you wouldn't have thought that. So there's just going to keep on pivots to allow people to enter the market. 5% mortgages, 90%, 95% mortgages on $5 million. There's always changes that are happening.
It's keeping the Ponzi scheme alive, as you said at the front. Chris, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really enjoyed speaking with you and to get your opinions as always. Just for those people who may need reminding, if you want to find out more about Chris, alcove.com.au is the website. Links are there. And Chris, I'm sure you'll be very pleased to chat to anybody who needs some specific help at the moment.
Thank you, Martin. Always good to chat. It's a late one for me. I have to get back to watching Rivals. I don't know if any of your listeners to watch that. It's on Disney. I'm quite enjoying it. But anyway, Martin, it's always good to chat. I'll chat to you in a few months, and hope you and the family and the dogs are doing well. Cheers, Chris, and the same to you. Thank you very much for coming on, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to take you off stream now. See you soon. Thanks, Martin. See ya. Bye. There we are, folks. Hope you found that illuminating. Chris is always good value. Next week, it'll be Damien Classon on, and we'll be talking about the markets and what's happened over the last month with the Trump effect and all of those things. That'll be worth watching. In terms of dogs, I can show you one dog. The other dog is under my table. So you only see one dog there, but Luna is sound asleep. And I think that's pretty much it. Jason, thank you very much, Super Chat. Really appreciate it. As always, really does help to cover the cost of what we do. And I hope everybody will have a good week, have a good vote. Make sure your vote counts. This is a really important election, I think. And decisions taken will, I think, determine quite a lot over the next little while. So it is worth just, figuring out how to vote effectively. Thank you very much for your time tonight. Enjoy your week. And check out the recorded shows if you don't see them normally. Remember, I put a show up every single day on finance and property and related stuff, and we have a live show every Tuesday. Thank you very much for your time tonight. I'm going to wish you a good evening, and I will see you next time. It's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Take care. See you next time. Bye.